Independence. It's as American an idea as hot dogs and summer fireworks. But this 4th of July week, we're looking at it from a different angle. What it means for central banks. You know, the men and women in the suits who pop up on your newsfeed talking about the economy.
I would have little confidence that the forecast, if we made a forecast today, if we were doing it
in their own special way. They're the centre point of a country's financial system. And their ability to set interest rates free from political interference is considered sacrosanct. But that operational independence is emerging as a campaign issue in the upcoming US presidential election. And that's something that has implications for economies around the world. So this week on Reuters Econ World, we're looking at independence for central banks. What does it really mean in practice? And what happens when it collides with political objectives? Like in Turkey. It's all part of the mission here on Reuters Econ World. We pick a buzzword or phrase and look at the economic principles and ideas driving the biggest news around the world. So this week, independence. I'm Carmel Crimmins in Dublin. Central banks play a number of important roles in an economy. One of the most important is to ensure stable prices. And they do that by setting short-term interest rates, what economists call monetary policy. Independence means that central banks have the freedom to set interest rates without interference from politicians. It became a thing after the 1970s. Back then, central banks were sometimes pressured by politicians to lower interest rates. They wanted to boost the economy and their own popularity, but it led to painful price increases and the conclusion that central banks should be given autonomy to fight inflation. But that view is up for debate again in the US. Some supporters of former President Donald Trump have talked about giving him more power over the Fed if he's re-elected in November. Neither Trump nor his team have taken an official stance on Fed policy. But he has said he wouldn't reappoint Fed Chair Jerome Powell. So what could all this mean? I'm delighted today to have two people well-versed in central banks and how they operate. Jonathan Spicer is our bureau chief in Turkey, and he covered the Fed during the Obama and the Trump presidencies. And Mark John, our European economics editor, who has covered the Bundesbank, the Bank of France, and the European Central Bank. John, Mark, welcome.
Good to be here, thank you.
In reality, Mark, how independent are central banks?
Yeah, I mean, it's never been absolute. It's actually relatively recent in the history of central banks. I mean, it really only sort of became a thing in statutory terms, sort of really in the late 80s and going into the 90s. And sometimes, and I'm sure Jonathan's got more to say on this than I have, sometimes it's more of a polite fiction than actual reality. That being said, you have moments like in July 2012, when Mario Draghi, at the time the head of the ECB, can literally stand up and with a few words, whatever it takes, literally end the crisis around the euro without, we are told, without any consultation with his political masters or even with his fellow policymakers, which was an absolutely sort of stunning kind of, if you like, decision that he took. And I suppose we mustn't forget that actually that was successful largely also because it was actually followed up with a series of policies which were then much more widely debated, and he was able to bring with him then a kind of a consensus within his own policymakers and more widely in effect. So, yeah, I think the point I would make is that, at the end of the day, central banks are still effectively political institutions with a very close link to the politics of the day.
What about you, John? What's your take on it? For the Fed, are they purely data-driven, or does politics come into play?
I always sense that politics was lingering around the edges all the time, even when you were talking about purely data-driven analysis. In the Fed's case, its mandate is in inflation stability and low and stable unemployment. And I recall whether it was Bernanke or Yellen or now Powell, they frustrated members of Congress never-endingly sometimes in their regular testimony to Congress. These members would try to get answers from them. They just wouldn't give it. I remember Ben Bernanke in particular during the financial crisis on issues of bank regulation. I mean, he was jealously guarding the Fed's independence at that time. And of course, with the independence comes that accountability. Yeah, so I think there's a lot of built-in mechanisms, a lot of protections for the Federal Reserve, for example, about how governors and chairs are nominated. It can't just be the president choosing it. The president has to choose it and the Senate has to confirm it. Once they're in, they're in. They have a term and they serve it out. Very, very rarely does a Fed policymaker leave before the due date.
What are the systems of checks and balances when it comes to the Fed?
Well, I mean, certainly the Federal Reserve, central banks can be reformed with new legislation and new rules. I think the employment mandate was brought in later than the inflation mandate in the American instance. So you see throughout history instances when the Fed is adjusted and shifted. It's hard, though, as you say. Yeah, the president can't just do it. He or she needs to get majorities or supermajorities in Congress to change the Federal Reserve Act in the United States. There are perhaps even higher bars in other central banks around the world and other legislation around the world. So it's hard. I could see it happening, although I do recall in Donald Trump's term as president, his first term, he too was talking about getting rid of, I guess, Janet Yellen at the time. And then he brought in Jay Powell, but he sort of went hot and cold on him. And I recall kind of behind the scenes, the Federal Reserve policymakers were saying that they're going to do everything they can to stay there and to fight that kind of impulse from the president. And certainly they have a lot of powers to do that. And I think another thing that sort of overhangs all this is that the system tends to work to have this independence. So even if you might have some members of Congress or some legislators talking aggressively about changing the mandate of a central bank, I think maybe when the rubber hits the road, they might have some hesitation about tinkering with something that's so very important.
We're all very sensitive about an independent Fed, Mark, aren't we? I mean, because the Federal Reserve, yes, it's the US central bank, but really it's the one that the whole world looks at when it comes to rate setting. The dollar is the de facto international reserve currency. And so much of that kind of confidence in the US stems from the idea that it's a stable democracy with strong institutions, rule of law. Do you get a sense sitting outside the US that people, investors are worried about what might happen post the November election?
I would say if they're not getting worried now, then they certainly will be if indeed that kind of scenario becomes more and more a possibility. I mean, as you say, Carmel, the dollar is so dominant on the international stage that anything that happens with the Fed will inevitably have an indirect bearing on how other central banks perceive their policy.
Tell us about the ECB. There's always a perception that it's far away in Frankfurt, full of technocrats, focused on the data, and its independence is protected by treaty. Is that really the case, though, or is it a very political animal?
Yeah, I mean, it's partly true. I'd say the fact that it is essentially an EU institution and that you've got representatives of 20 countries that make up the Eurozone, to a certain extent shields it from the cut and thrust of domestic national politics. In terms of the political debate, you have around that table people that come from the Southern European countries and Northern European countries with different views on where rates should be, different views on fiscal policy, interaction, austerity, and so on. And those views will go into a mix. The job of the ECB president, Christine Lagarde, is to actually sort of come up with a consensus, which, if you like, gets a bit beyond the politics and truly reflects, if you like, kind of a pan-Eurozone view on where rates should be going.
One place that often springs to mind when we think of central bank independence is Turkey. President Erdogan has not been shy about saying what should happen with interest rates, and he's been very quick to replace central bank governors. The country has had 6 central bank chiefs in the last 5 years, John.
It has been quite head-spinning, actually, to move from covering the Federal Reserve to covering the Turkish central bank, especially in this era, which really is kind of perhaps the perfect experiment, even academic experiment in central bank independence or lack thereof. Yes, President Erdogan had and has arguably a unique view on monetary policy and inflation. He says that one needs to cut interest rates in order to cut inflation. Obviously, completely unorthodox view, but he carried out this experiment in technicolors, in the last 5 to 6 years with some very, very damaging results for the real economy.
I mean, to that point, John, about the impact that Turkey's central bank policy can have on people, you spoke to a very interesting person recently in the world of business about the interest rate cuts and the interest rate hikes and the impact that it's having on them.
That's right. His name is Alper Yakupur. He has a company called Urtex. It's just west of Istanbul. They're in the fabrics business, okay? They weave and dye fabrics.
Mm-hmm.
Mostly it's an exporter. They import some yarn and what have you from India and China. Mostly they export to Europe, North Africa, and to North America.
So very exposed to exchange rates and fluctuations, right?
Exactly. And given the fact that even the last 3 years alone, the Turkish lira has depreciated by 75% in 3 years alone versus the dollar.
Whoa.
See, you hear that and you think that must be good for exporters.
Yeah.
But it should make their products cheaper. But as he explains, the volatility and the added layers of complexity in the policy and in financial markets just made it more difficult. This company, his great-grandfather founded it. And as he says, Turkey's used to high inflation. It's used to bouts of high inflation.
So basically, since COVID times, to tell you the truth, we stopped making any money. We can't grow. We stopped. There's no profits. And so there's basically there's no point in doing a business where you don't make any profit.
And the central bank currently, there's a new governor. They've hiked rates aggressively to try and deal with that inflationary problem. But that has also had a huge impact when you're a business person, right?
You could say that the concept of independent central banking kind of won out, at least in the last year. The president is known to be a little bit unpredictable with his decisions, so let's see. But for now, the interest rate has been risen to 50% from 8.5%. We are starting to finally see some anchoring in inflation. Inflation is expected to come down toward the end of the year. But with an aggressive tightening of policy, you get the impact on the real economy. And so we're going to see more unemployment. We are already seeing a slowdown in growth. And for employers like Alper, becomes increasingly harder to retain staff during this slowdown. And very importantly, as it gets harder and harder for him to access any kind of credit.
I mean, basically, then you can't grow. Either you must pay from your own pocket or getting loans at 70, 75, sometimes 80% interest rates from the Turkish lira. You can never make 120% profit in your business. So you pay the bank 70 or 80%.
So if you're borrowing money, the rates are exorbitant. But if you're saving money, the rate's also very high.
I live in Istanbul here. We are still in a cost of living crisis. But amid all of that, you open up your bank app on your phone and they're offering you 50% rate on a deposit account. So you put some lira in there and you are earning quite a bit. And so there are, probably encountered a handful of people just in the last few months who are saying, yeah, I'm just not working now. I'm just living on the interest on my Turkish lira deposit accounts.
Wow.
It's another sort of, perhaps not unexpected, but twisted bit of fallout from this experiment with unorthodox policy and this experiment with cutting rates for so many years in the face of rising inflation.
There are plenty of examples of the unintended consequences of politics on the work of central banks. Right, Mark?
We also have, if we want to talk about Russia, a very special case.
Fascinating.
It fascinates, I think, indeed.
Yeah.
With Nabiullina, the central bank governor. What we've seen, obviously, in the last couple of years, the extent to which any monetary policy official can be truly independent in a country run by Vladimir Putin. So, for example, if we look at what happened in August of 2023, she was under huge pressure to raise interest rates to protect the ruble. Thus, at that point, she was still sticking to the kind of the free flow to the ruble type policy and was hoping it would keep its own, stand on its own 2 feet. It was really only when one of Putin's aides came in and publicly said this is all wrong that, sure enough, very soon afterwards, there was a succession of emergency rate hikes coming from her office. I think the other question is there seems to be no evidence whatsoever that she was made aware that Russia was planning to invade Ukraine. Now, you can take that in two ways. I mean, one, is it reasonable to assume that a central bank governor would be given a heads up of something as strategically sensitive as that, or not? One way or the other, what it did mean is that when the invasion came, there were effectively lots of Russian assets that were stranded abroad, and the central bank did not have the time to, shall we say, organize a kind of retreat of those assets.
Right. I mean, Russia probably provides a pretty extreme example of, even if the government isn't trying to sack you or pick up the phone and insist that interest rates are cut, just simply by carrying out policies, they can absolutely sideswipe you and completely impact monetary policy. Maybe a more mundane example is just deficit spending, right? Spending and spending and spending so that you're inflating the economy and making the job of the central banker really, really difficult, right? And that's something perhaps we're seeing increasingly with debt levels the way they're going, Mark.
I think this is something which is increasingly worrying for central bankers everywhere. Since the pandemic, the world has been running debt levels, record or near record levels. That debt has to be serviced. And if rates are going up, that obviously increases the level of debt serving to a point which is frankly worrying for some nations. And there comes a point when you can worry that governments will step in and say, we cannot actually tolerate this level of these rate hikes, because it would break the bank. And it's that kind of so-called fiscal dominance, which, if it's not happening already, is something which is going to be certainly a concern for the future as long as we have these debt levels.
When we look at central bank independence, we often look at it perhaps through the lens of whoever holds power in government, their ability to sway and influence. But personality also matters in terms of who's in charge in a central bank.
Well, I think one thing that it reflects is that I think the Mario Draghi do whatever it takes example is perhaps the extreme end of the spectrum of independence of central banks, right? And I think throughout the world, you'll have different gradients of how central banks operate.
Right.
In emerging markets and what have you. There is a degree, I think, of coordination with fiscal authorities, with the government. It makes some sense to have some coordination, right? Are we tightening or are we loosening policy here? And let's try to not cut across each other's policies. And so I think that makes sense. I think different countries try to get at that differently. Going back to the Turkey example, I think there's a general understanding that the president, the government gets some sort of understanding of where policy might be headed ahead of the policy decision. There's a lot of speculation about that. Even now that the central bank is tightening, that the policy path seems to be on a more orthodox and independent level. I'll point out the Constitutional Court here just a few weeks ago came out with a ruling saying that Erdogan's sort of power, which was granted to him and signed off by him in 2018 to fire and appoint central bank governors, is unconstitutional. There was a power that came in after the attempted coup of 2016. And the court has now given the government a year to legislate that. And perhaps, let's see, go back to a system of more checks and balances.
Mark, John, thank you so much.
Yeah, it was a pleasure being here. Thanks.
Thanks, Carmel.
That's it for this week's episode. If you're listening in the US, we hope your July 4th celebrations come with a nice slice of apple pie. And for those outside the US, remember, you never need an excuse for cake. As for us, we'll be back next week. No excuses. In the meantime, I'd like to thank John Spicer, Mark John, and everyone who covers economics at Reuters. Thanks to Jonah Green for his production help on this episode. Sound design was by Josh Summer. Leela de Kretzer is our executive producer. Our podcast team includes Kim Vinnell, Tara Oakes, Christopher Walljasper, David Spencer, and Gail Issa. I'm your host, Carmel Crimmins. For all your daily news, check out Reuters World News, our weekday podcast, on the Reuters app or wherever you get your podcasts.